Hi, welcome back. We're going to talk about Chapter 2, Epidemiology. What is epidemiology? And epidemiology is a science, it's a public health science that deals with how to measure the uh, exposures and outcome relationship. What that means? It means that when a person is exposed to environmental agents, biological pathogens, or chemicals, the person eventually can be sick. Okay, so the epidemiological science tries to figure out how many of uh, the individuals that were exposed and how many of them got sick. Okay, so in other words, epidemiology tries to understand. I mean, when I say understand, it means explain. It explains the association between an exposure and outcome. For example, if somebody is living in an area where there is a vast industrial expansions, okay, uh, that person will be continuously exposed to various types of gases, dust, and things of that nature. Okay, so I can use epidemiological tools to figure out whether these exposures will eventually cause sickness in the person. Okay, when the proportion of people that are getting sick from these exposures is high, then we can figure out, we can say that uh, I mean with advanced statistics, that odds ratios and risk ratios, we can see that there is this particular exposure is associated with the outcome. Okay, now the causation is different. Causation could be uh, uh, when I say causation, we need to understand there is uh, clinical causation, practical causation, and statistical causation. When all these three are saying the same thing, then it's confirmed cause. So for epidemiological purposes, most of the time we are looking at the statistics. Okay, and eventually people do further studies, and then that becomes the established fact. And then with the chapter 4 policy development, and we work on developing the policies to remove that cause so that people don't get sick. Okay, with this understanding, we're going to understand what are the tools of epidemiology. Okay, there are two things. One is the measures of disease occurrence, and the other one is the measures of disease association. Okay, so what are the measures of disease occurrence? The first is prevalence. Okay, the prevalence is basically at any given time, how many people are sick from a particular disease. For example, what is the prevalence of hypertension in the United States? So how you calculate that? You say the denominator will be total U.S. population, and the numerator will be the people that have hypertension. And whatever the proportion that comes, that is a prevalence for that particular time. Okay, incidence. Okay, incidence is different. In incidence, you are talking about how many people that newly developed hypertension. Okay, so in the United States in 2019, how many people that were diagnosed with hypertension? Okay, that's a new development. It's not existing disease. When we talk about existing disease, as in previous example, we use prevalence. When we talk about a new disease, a newly developed, newly diagnosed, newly found out disease when you talk about incidence rate. Okay, there is a third one is a case fatality rate. So case fatality rate is where uh, the people that died from a particular cause. Okay, so for example, what is the case fatality rate of lung cancer? Okay, so your denominator population will be total people that had lung cancer. Okay, um, and that will be denominator, not numerator. You understand this? And in a numerator, people that died from lung cancer. So out of so and so people who had lung cancer, so and so people died. Okay, that's case fatality rate. So the deadlier the disease, the higher the case fatality. Okay, for example, case fatality rate, and now you can break it down to different types of cancers. For example, case fatality rate for pancreatic cancer is very, very high, but case fatality rate for breast cancer is relatively low because of advanced screening programs that we have now, and so that, for example, mammography, and so that is done routine basis, so that even if the person do not have any symptoms, the disease could be diagnosed in time, and time is essence when we talk about cancer. Okay, so these three measures are very important. Now we talk about the measures of disease association. Okay, so this is a little bit complicated. So we are trying to find out the association between exposure and outcome. Okay, so here you need 2 by 2 table. Okay, so for example, when uh, when we talk about the like an previous example, the industrial people who are living in industrial area, what is the likelihood that they will develop respiratory diseases? Respiratory diseases are basically your diseases of lung, throat, and rhinitis, and so on and so forth. So, what are the likelihood that people will develop diseases from living in industrial areas? So, what do we do? So, we basically take a proportion of people who live in the industrial area. We take a proportion of people who don't live in industrial area. Okay, so some of the people who live in industrial area will be normal, and some of the people who do not live in industrial area might have disease. Okay, so we're trying to see. So there is a calculation. We're trying to see the odds of developing lung respiratory diseases. So that's odds ratio. So what are the odds of developing a disease versus the odds of developing, or in other words, odds of developing a disease divided by odds of not developing disease, and that ratio is odds ratio. Okay, similarly, you can also talk about risk ratio. Risk ratio is where it's a different calculation, and you can see in the literature, in the PowerPoint, where you need to see the marginal. We have to take the marginal tables for risk ratios. Okay, so we are talking about risk ratios there. You can see that in the PowerPoints. In the nutshell, what's happening is basically odds ratios you use for case control studies and cross-sectional studies, and risk ratios you use for cohort studies. This takes me to study design concept. Okay, study designs. Whenever there are research studies, human research studies, epidemiology talks about humans. Okay, we're not talking about animals. Okay, there are animal studies that are conducted in lab. They're not epidemiological studies. Um, the studies that are related to humans, they are epidemiological studies. So what are the study designs? Cohort, case control, cross-sectional. What is a cohort? Cohort is where everybody is normal, and then we follow the participants and see how many of them develop disease. Now this cohort is basically, for example, in industry, like we said, For example, people who live in industrial area, so that is a cohort. All the PH 161 section 12 is also a cohort. You're all classmates. That is a cohort. So there is some characteristic that is similar to everybody. That makes a cohort. So, for example, this cohort, industrial people, people living in industrial area, and that's cohort, and they're followed for, let's say, 10 years, 15 years, and then see how many people develop disease. That's cohort study. Case control is different. For case control, this is done for rare diseases. Okay. So when, for example, if somebody has, unfortunately, some people are developed with congenital diseases. Those are for lifetime, unfortunately. Some of them are can be resolved by surgeries. So, for example, we are trying to see the association between pesticide exposure and the outcome on fetus. So, if a fetus develops a rare disease, then that all the children, all the kids that are born with that disease, that becomes cases, and then a matched controls. So other kids that were born in a similar neighborhood, same neighborhood, and similar type of exposures, and matching characteristics are sought. So basically, same thing again. Exposures are common for them, and there is 2 by 2 table, and we're trying to see whether that pesticide exposure is causing this type of illnesses. So that's case control studies. So you talk about cases first, and then we find a matched controls, and then we do the analysis. Usually we find risk with odds ratios. What is the likelihood of developing congenital disease from exposure of pesticides? So that is case control studies. Cross-sectional is different. Cross-sectional study is in a snapshot between exposure and outcome. Okay, it takes so for example, when somebody is doing a study where you are trying to when we are measuring exposure and outcome at the same time, and we're trying to see the association between exposure and outcome, that's a cross-sectional study. Okay. What is an example? For example, blood pressure studies. Okay. So for example, physiological blood pressure studies. So if a person is asked to do some exercise, and then they take a blood pressure, and then they want to see across different age group, so they are given an exercise. So that's exposure. You measure that, and followed by measurement of blood pressure. So measurement of exposure, then measurement of outcome, which is blood pressure. At the same time, it gives you a snapshot. So that's a cross-sectional study. Okay. So these are the study designs. Then we talked about these analysis part, odds ratios, researchers. Be careful about those. Try to understand the calculations of those. Could be questions on the quiz. The midterm. Okay. Then we talked about the limitations of epidemiology. You can go through the PowerPoints. The uses of epidemiology. It talks about human data. It's a very important tool. Surveillance activity that is conducted. Disease surveillance I'm talking about by FoodNet program, or you say diseases surveillance by CDC that is conducted to understand the any influx of any type of diseases that are going on in the community. For example, flu shots are given, so influenza seasons that come there, they check, they monitor how many people are getting influenza from what type of strain, and they advise flu shot. That's all all those reports that are coming. That's epidemiology. Okay. Hopefully, you might find this video helpful. This chapter is people find this chapter most difficult one. That's why this video is a little bit longer. Stay tuned, and next week I will be talking about chapter 4, environmental policy. Okay. Have a very good week. See ya.